have Eleanor Neff Powell here today, and she is a professor at Yale Department of Political Science, but many of you probably know her because she did her PhD here, and you finished in 2009, right? She's going to be presenting some of her new work on money and painting. So, take it away, Eleanor.
Great, thank you for having me. Well, the question I'm going to be talking about today is, what is the influence of money in politics? And the answer to this question is really relevant to our understanding the nature and quality of democratic representation in American politics. Both because it will better, and further, it will help us actually understand as the Supreme Court considers further loosening campaign finance regulations, the answer to this question is particularly relevant today. Right? That both understand the potential policy ramifications of those rulings, but also to understand, also because academic findings in this area have played a central role in these court cases. So we want to understand what the influence of money in politics is. And if we were to ask the average American citizen what their views of money in politics are, they might give you an answer something like this, a sort of swirling mass of ideas about influence and bribes, corruption, earmarks, with no sort of clearly defined answers. And if we were to talk to former members of Congress, former lobbyists, normative theorists such as Harvard's own Dennis Thompson, legal scholars such as Larry Lessig, among others, they might paint a fairly similar picture, and sort of lots of scattered and qualitative accounts of the influence of money in politics, but we have relatively less systematic quantitative evidence on this point. In fact, work in their sort of seminal piece summarizing the state of the literature in this area, and Solbeher, De Figueiredo, and Snyder said the following. We surveyed nearly 40 articles. In 3 out of 4 instances, campaign contributions had no statistically significant effects on legislation or had the wrong sign, suggesting that more contributions lead to less support. In fact, after controlling for legislator ideology, these contributions have no detectable effects on the behavior of legislators. So essentially showing that a lot of the quantitative evidence on this point boils down to the idea that money has no impact on politics, and the cases where it might appear to have impact can mostly be explained away by ideology. Donors are giving to friendly legislators who share their ideological beliefs, and thus campaign contributions have no impact on legislator behavior. Okay? Painting sort of 2 very different pictures. And so what I'm going to talk about today is presenting some of the first systematic and causally identified quantitative evidence showing the role of access and money on political outcomes. So what I'm going to talk about today is, why do corporations and PACs contribute? And I say PACs because under current campaign finance rules, corporations aren't allowed to contribute directly to the campaigns of members of Congress, but instead they can set up what's called a PAC, a political action committee. And this political action committee, they can organize the PAC, they can underwrite its costs, and they can direct its contributions. This is effectively the way we're seeing a lot of corporate activity in politics. And the question is, why are these PACs contributing? Why are they going to the time and energy to set up these PACs and to spend the money in this way? All right, and there are 2 sort of primary explanations. The first is the sort of access-motivated giving. And access is a really broad category that includes a wide variety of giving behaviors. So this could include, on the mild end of the spectrum, contributions that they have the intent of essentially buying the member's time to inform and persuade the member to bring them around to your point of view. Then to the far other extreme of the spectrum, where essentially at the far end could really be illegal behavior in terms of quid pro quo exchange of contributions for legislative favors. And so there's a broad array of activity that can all fall under this access-oriented giving behavior. By contrast, the other explanation, the other big picture explanation, is one of ideology. And this could include a wide variety of giving as well. This could be ideologically motivated giving, giving with the intent of influencing electoral outcomes, partisan giving, or even giving that's analogous to sort of economic consumption ideas, sort of charitable giving, right? This all falls under the category of ideologically motivated giving. And what we want to do today is we want to try to disentangle access-motivated giving from ideologically motivated giving. Now, anytime we're talking, this is of course a difficult question to answer. We run into all of the usual problems studying the influence of money in politics. So of course we have problems, the sort of classic problems of endogeneity. But even on top of those usual problems of endogeneity, we have problems of observational equivalence. So under a lot of circumstances, giving that's ideologically motivated can appear the same as giving that's access-oriented. So if we were to imagine giving to Republicans in the House of Representatives today, that could be both ideologically motivated giving, but it could also be access-oriented if they're in the majority party and control most of the levers of legislative power. And so these things are difficult to tease out. And then, of course, the other problem is one of political sensitivity. Anytime you're talking about money in politics, you're talking about essentially a range of behavior that could at a minimum be politically embarrassing for a member, but at the far end of the extreme could even have legal repercussions as well. So members have all sorts of incentives to try to hide or obfuscate any sort of relationships between money and politics that might be going on here. So the question is, how do we disentangle giving motives? And in an ideal world, we want to exogenously vary the legislative access or influence a member has and observe how donors behave. Now, Speaker Boehner is a little closed-minded, and he won't actually let us randomize his Congress. And that's, fine. Maybe someday in the future you all convince him to do this. But until he does, he gets on board, we're left with the sort of real world. And essentially what I'm going to talk about today is that my co-author, Justin Grimmer, and I have identified a quirk of the legislative rules that essentially meets this criteria of exogenously varying the legislative influence a member has, and we can follow and observe how donors behave. And so the quirk I'm going to talk about is this process of committee exile. And if you don't know what this term is, there's a very good reason for it. It has never actually been studied before, and it's a term that Justin and I coined in our earlier work on this process, and I'll go into detail on exactly what that is in a minute. But just to sort of give you the quick 30-second version, it's essentially analogous to members randomly getting kicked off congressional committees. That's going to let us observe what happens when they lose their influence over one part of the policymaking process. So our causal identification strategy is going to be one of committee exile. This is going to help us to disentangle this role of ideologically versus access-oriented giving, because these members are the same members, they represent the same district, they have the same policy positions. All that's changing is their influence over one part of the policymaking process. And so in addition to the nice properties of committee exile, looking at this committee stage of the process is a good place to look for the influence of money in politics. Committees are central, they're where laws are drafted and amended, but they're much less visible than other parts of the process, such as roll call voting, that are more typically studied. But because they're more visible, they're sort of less likely potential levers for the role of money in politics. Okay, but I want to step back for a minute and talk about what is committee exile. And as I said before, there's a very good reason if you're not familiar with this term. This really is a sort of new thing that hasn't been studied before. And we define committee exile to be the involuntary removal of legislators from committees. So this happens when party losses are unevenly distributed across congressional committees. So this primarily happens to the minority party after wave elections, and there's very little strategic manipulation going on here. And both parties follow a seniority system in which members with the fewest terms on the committee, sort of least senior members, are most likely to be kicked off the committee. And moreover, for our, yeah.
What's a wave election?
So it's these big elections where lots of people win. So like 2010 with the Tea Party wave, usually it involves changing control of the chamber. So it's just a huge election where one party takes a lot of the seats, a big change in the sort of existing balance of power. So both parties use the seniority system in terms of who to kick off. And for our purposes, what's even better about the seniority system is that seniority is actually randomized within cohorts. So if two members joined a committee at the same time, it's randomly assigned who is going to be more senior on the committee. Right? So in many cases, it's exactly random whether you were kicked off this committee. In other cases, it's sort of a happenstance whether you're unlucky enough to be there in terms of your relative seniority on the committee. So essentially, this is a selection on observables design in which seniority and committee tenure are the observables that are influencing your exile. And what's important for our purposes here is that members who are exiled are strikingly similar to those who remain on the committee. So prior to losing their seat, across all the different characteristics we can measure, from ideology, fundraising, legislative outcomes, etc., they're all pretty much the same before exile. So this is an important property of the design that's going to let us do a lot of different things going forward.
They're obviously not different on age, like seniority by virtue of the design. Do we think that the more senior members of these committees are also the most influential?
Well, so probably yes. And so one of the things I'm going to talk about is essentially this is going to be a local treatment effect that we can essentially identify this effect among relatively senior people who are getting kicked off. So if anything, I would argue this probably means that we're underestimating the effect because we're not including people like committee chairs and the really powerful ranking members and others. So we're talking about essentially the effect of these committees among the sort of mid-tier, lower to mid-tier seniority people. Yeah, that's just the nature of the design. Yeah, Patrick.
So when you say randomized, do they literally flip a coin?
So for two members who are assigned to the committee at the same time, it is actually randomized coin flipping in terms of the seniority. And that happens not at this exile stage, that happens when they're initially assigned to the committee. So that happens sort of long prior to this decision.
Can you just give us a sense of size, like how big are the committees and how many people are there?
Yeah, so the committees, they range a bit in size, but we're talking about sort of committees on the range of sort of 30 or 40 members. And so on each party, you're talking about, 15 to 20 members of the committee. And so Exile is a pretty rare event because you have to have a sort of big enough wave election in order for the ratios to change enough for people to get kicked off.
So the committees, basically the number of seats in a committee is proportional to the overall representation of the party. That how, like, what causes the exiles? You're trying to rebalance, they're trying to rebalance the number of seats owned by Democrats.
Yes, exactly. So basically what happens with the exile is when parties' losses are unevenly distributed across congressional committees. So in some committees, too many Democrats win relative to the chamber as a whole. And then in the new Congress, you have to adjust the ratios of the committee to reflect the new balance of power in the chamber. And so I'll walk through a detailed example of this in a minute so you can get a better idea. So please stop me if it's still unclear at that stage.
Isn't it the case that sometimes rather than exiling people from it, that they just add seats to the committee? They make the committee a little bit bigger, and so like if the Republicans win a lot higher percentage, they'll just add 1 or 2 Republican seats to the committee. Does that ever happen?
So technically they have the option to do that. They have the option to change the committee size as well, but in practice we don't really see that. So in practice what we see is the reverse, is people are losing these committees. Now
So the size is just, it's fixed for the most part.
For the most part, it's fixed. There are a few changes, but for the most part, it's fixed. Yeah, and they might be more inclined to do this if this was happening to the majority party, right? The majority party is the one who gets to really decide the size of the committees, but in practice, this is usually happening to the minority. Okay, so we're going to really look at 2 questions today. The first is going to look at how are corporations or PACs responding when members experience a decrease in access or a decrease in influence over a policy area that they care about. Right? So we're particularly concerned about policy-relevant access. And then the second part of the talk, we're actually going to flip this around to look at the reverse. So how are corporations responding when members experience an increase in influence, an increase in access over a policy domain that they care about? And so just to sort of briefly preview the results, we're going to, in the first part, we're going to exploit exile as an exogenous shock to legislative access. And we're going to begin with a couple of case studies. So first, we're going to look at how are energy PACs responding when members lose their seat on the Energy and Commerce Committee. And what we see is an individual member loses about $100,000 immediately upon losing their seat on the Energy and Commerce Committee. Then we're going to look at how do finance PACs respond when members lose their seat on the Ways and Means Committee. You see that's about $165,000, a single member losing $165,000. Now, the Ways and Means Committee is a quite unusual committee. The Ways and Means Committee is the committee that affects the entire U.S. tax code. So we can imagine all corporations or industries caring about the tax code and sort of their own personal ramifications therein. So we then look at how are all PACs responding to members losing their seat on the Ways and Means Committee. And we see that members who are exiled from the Ways and Means Committee lose about $325,000 immediately upon losing their seat on the committee. Now, just to put that in scale, the average House election is in the last election cycle was about $1.5 million. So $300,000 is actually real money in the sort of scheme of their overall cost of their campaigns. And so after going through these case studies, we're going to systematize this relationship of policy-relevant industries in the topic area of the committee. And when we systemize this relationship, we find more generally that members lose influence in the policy area. Policy-relevant industries drop their contributions. Okay, so that's the first part of the paper. And then the second part of the paper, we want to look at where does this money go, right? So you stop giving to the people who lose their influence over this policy area. Who do you start giving to instead? And so in the second part, we depart from our exile design to look at where corporations donate after a new majority. Okay? And what we see is corporations increase their contributions to members who experience the greatest increase in access influence. Right? And so what does that mean? Well, they're actually contributing to people of the opposite party. So for example, a Democrat loses their seat on the Ways and Means Committee, and these corporations start giving to the Republican who gets their old seat on the committee. So these giving patterns are pretty difficult to reconcile with ideological giving, and they're at least suggestive that there's at least some access-oriented giving happening among these contributors. But again, this is just a sort of quick preview. I want to step back for a minute and talk about in detail what exactly Committee Exile looks like. So here we're going to talk about the career of Congresswoman Allyson Schwartz. She's a Democratic rising star from Pennsylvania. So she was first elected in 2004 to the 109th Congress. And in her second term, she was lucky enough to get a seat on the prestigious Ways and Means Committee, the committee that writes the tax code. Okay. And so all was going well for her, and she talked about how this new seat on the Ways and Means Committee would help provide her with increased opportunities for her to represent and benefit her district, the Commonwealth, and the country. Right, so all was going well for her career until we have the arrival of the Tea Party in the form of the 2010 midterm elections. Right? As we all know, the Republicans swept control of the House. Right? So they retook control of the House. Now our friend Congresswoman Schwartz did win re-election. But we have a problem. Right? So the Democrats had uneven losses across congressional committees. And so what this meant is that in the new Congress, we need to adjust the committees to reflect the new majority. And this meant that there was a surplus of Democrats on some committees, where essentially too many Democrats won relative to the chamber as a whole. Now, of course, this led to some unhappy campers. And Politico, of course, was on the scene to document the drama and the intrigue. And so in their typically understated prose, they talked about how if House Democrats seem ready to eat their young as they tussle for scarce morsels of influence, it's because they are. The party's most talented young guns are getting knocked off A-list committees precisely because they're young and talented. Good enough to get on the committees in the first place, but too new to Congress to have attained much seniority. Right, so Committee Exile is a big event in terms of the individual members, in terms of the party, and there's no amount of rising superstarness that can save you from exile. Right? This is purely a function of seniority, whether you're getting to keep or getting to lose your seat. And the members themselves weren't happy about this as well, so Congressman Bruce Braley said, "I'm disappointed by the harsh reality of this election and its impact on the ratios," i.e. the committee ratio. Members are not happy. Okay, so what happened to our friend Congresswoman Schwartz? Well, after the election on Ways and Means, there were 15 Democratic seats available, and Congresswoman Schwartz ranked 17th in Democratic seniority on the committee, which meant that she, along with Democrats ranked 16 to 21, were all removed from the committee. Right? So there's a clear cut line after that 15 spot, and everybody else loses their seat among Democrats on the committee. Now, she was lucky. She did get some compensation. She was given a seat on the Foreign Affairs Committee as compensation. But her ability to return to the Ways and Means Committee was actually uncertain until 2013. So both parties promised members essentially first right of return. So you lose your seat, and you're going to be able to get back on, essentially in the order in which you were kicked off. Sort of most senior first, getting back on, and so forth. But many of her fellow exiles to this day have still not had an opportunity to return, right? Because she was relatively high in seniority among the folks who were kicked off. Okay, so just to talk about a few more points about exiles. The case of Congresswoman Schwartz is actually relatively unusual. Exiles rarely receive compensation in terms of another seat on when they lose their seat with exile. So only about 80% of members receive no compensating seat assignment. So getting an additional seat is pretty rare. Most members are just out of committee assignment, period. Now, to better understand how members perceive exile, we conducted some interviews with actual members of Congress. So one of the people I spoke to is Congresswoman DeLauro, a Democrat from Connecticut, and she's actually the perfect person to talk to about the committee exile process. So she herself was exiled in the 104th Congress, that 1994 big Republican wave, and she got back on the Appropriations Committee in the 105th Congress. And it's amazing, talking to her now, 20 years later, she could rattle off the people who had been just ahead of her in seniority, who had gotten to keep their assignment just below her in seniority, who got to get back on when. I mean, this was a sort of like deeply, viscerally scarring experience that 20 years later, this was all at the top of her mind. Not fun. So more recently, she's been on the other side of the table. So more recently, she's chaired the Steering and Policy Committee following the 2010 Republican landslide. So she was essentially on the committee. They got to tell everyone they were losing their seats. This did also not sound like a fun job. And so she basically explained that, they assure members they have first right of return, they'll be able to go back on the committee in the order in which they were kicked off. But, she admitted when pressed that really as a member, you never actually know, even with the assurances of leadership, whether you're going to be able to go back to your committee. You don't know when a vacancy is going to open up, and you don't know if future leaders are going to honor the promises of current leaders to adhere to seniority rules in letting people go back to their committees. Okay. And empirically in our data, only about 10% of exiles later return to their original committee. So there is some substantial uncertainty here about returning to your committee assignment. Now, turning to the data, we see that most of our cases of exile are coming from these big wave election years. So 1994, 2006, when the Democrats retook control of the House, and then 2010 with the Tea Party wave. And as you remember, our cases of exile are being generated by this mismatch of essentially how Democrats on that particular committee fared, or members on that particular committee, relative to the chamber as a whole. So there are some idiosyncrasies in terms of how many cases we have per committee, and that's what's being generated. It's being generated by this mismatch process of our cases of exile. Okay, so I want to take just a minute to talk about why we want to use exile to measure access, and not, for an example, a member's initial committee assignment. Right? And the truth here is that the fundamental problem is it's difficult for us to observe all the characteristics that influence a member's initial committee assignment. Right? So there's some characteristics from the literature on the committee assignment process that are fairly easy for us to measure. So things like seniority, party loyalty in terms of your voting record with the party, and how much fundraising you do for the party are all characteristics that the literature says are important and that we could measure relatively easily. But there are other characteristics we really can't measure. And these are basically come down to talent, among other things. So political skill, persuasion, legislative capacity, we just don't have good measures of. Right? So these would be very difficult for us to try to measure. So the solution here really is to look at the committee exile process. And the committee exile is going to basically let us help mitigate unmeasured confounding. Right? These measures had the sufficient political skills and profile to get on the committee in the first place, and so we can compare them to the folks who remained on the committee.
So why not, rather than using exile, why not just look at, when two people are assigned to a committee at the same time, and if you know their, I don't know if you know their seniority order, but why not just compare those two to each other and see what the donation behavior is, and rather than having to wait for them to be exiled,
So just look at the impact of the relative seniority on the committee?
Right. I mean, maybe it could just be that companies or whoever's making these donations just have no idea about that, but I mean, it seems like it's another way you can explore this, right?
Yeah, that's a good idea. We haven't done that in terms of looking at the relative seniority ranking. There are people who have looked at the sort of relative seniority ranking. So there's work by Shepsley and Kellerman looking at this sort of relative seniority ranking, but I don't think they look at money in their paper. That's a good idea.
So, how do you distinguish between changes in campaigning contributions to individuals that accrue to this exile process versus changes that would accrue because the sort of overall political landscape is changing, and on certain issue areas, like, the Republicans are in, we better reallocate like what we're spending our money on across these different committees. How do we separate those two things out?
So one of the things that we're going to do is we're going to restrict our sample, so we're only comparing essentially co-partisans to avoid these systematic shifts. So we're only going to compare essentially Democrats who are exiled from Ways and Means to the Democrats who remain on the Ways and Means committee. Right? And that sample restriction is actually pretty important to avoid all of these systematic party shocks that are happening with these wave elections that are generating our cases of exile. So it's a great point. Okay, so more generally, this is a design that can help us answer a variety of difficult questions. And so in earlier work on the subject, Justin and I have argued that committees serve as an electoral subsidy, and when members lose their seat on a committee, this changes their focus from policymaking in Washington to re-election in the district. And this change in focus manifests itself across a variety of different ways. So we see members actually spend less time legislating, do less legislating, they spend less time in Washington, and instead they're focusing on re-election in the district. So they actually raise more money overall through additional effort after exile, and they vote more in line with their district for members who are from misaligned districts. And then we're going to look at this today, use the same design today to answer these questions about the influence of money in Congress. So today we're talking about how does legislative influence affect contributions, and really what does this then imply about the motives of contributors? So we're going to use Exile to disentangle contributors' motives, and we're going to build our estimation strategy around Exile. So Exile is going to serve as our clear assignment mechanism, and we're going to essentially restrict our sample to do exactly what Dustin was suggesting. So we're going to restrict our samples, so we're only looking at the co-partisans who remain on the committee. And particularly, we're going to focus our comparisons to those who are closest to the cutoff, who just missed getting kicked off the committee. And our dependent variable is going to be PAC contributions. And then to address any sort of remaining imbalance, we're going to control for the lag dependent variable, these seniority variables related to the selection of Exile, some potential confounders in terms of member and district characteristics, and then have committee and year fixed effects. And then when we do some, when we look at some of the committee-specific effects of Exile, we're going to include an Exile committee type indicator variable. And then at the end, when we look at some sector-specific models, we're going to restrict our donations to donations from that sector's PACs. And I'll go into a little more detail when we get to those. So this is the sort of basic framework we're going to use. Yeah.
I was just wondering, maybe you could say something about why you set it up with the lag DB and not just as a sort of a simpler different that you just sort of within the legislator's career before and after the Exile compared to the people who don't. That seems to me like it would be the more sort of natural way to set it up.
Yeah, I mean, I think you could do it either way. I think this way seemed a little more intuitive to us, but we've looked at it both ways. I mean, you get very similar results. It's not affecting the results. Yeah, I mean, we could look at it in terms of a diff and diff as well. Mm-hmm.
There are economists who think you can like the, I mean, you're assuming there are no common emitted variables that affect both the DB and the lag DB in both situations. That's totally impossible.
So
Lag here doesn't make a difference.
yeah. So you'd rather see the diff and diff that.
Self-promoting, go read chapter 9 of the
Okay.
The version is coming out in the second edition. I mean, you're essentially making some assumption about what the trajectory of the dependent variable in the absence of treatment. It's counterfactual, and the question is, are there either strong theoretical reasons or can you test whatever assumptions you're making about that trajectory? Fixed effects make a difference. So lag dependent variables are making quite specific assumptions. So there are a whole range of assumptions in order to each of them. Show that if Gary knows the result he wants, I'll tell him how to estimate the model so he gets exactly how to get that result. I mean,
Yeah, these results have been pretty robust on different specifications that we've tried. But if you'd rather see, I mean, you'd rather see the instrument version,
well, like, yeah, you're walking off into, a thorny area that's difficult to do. Particularly if you have multiple pre-treatment measures, there are various tests that you can have about whether you can correctly specify them. Effectively, let's say 89 jazz.
But your story here is that the treatment send is essentially random.
yes.
So is it?
Yes. So I can show you the balance of these folks before and afterwards. I was hoping someone would let me do this slide.
Generate matched pairs.
Yeah.
Or matched groups, but
Yep. We've done the sort of matching approach as well, doing the sort of match pairs, and it all produces pretty similar outcomes. Yeah. So essentially, with the exception of the seniority variables, relative rank, and tenure, essentially everything we can measure prior to Exile looks the same. So we can look at vote share, campaign spending, ideology to nominate, district partisanship, fundraising, individual funds, PAC funds, bill authorship, days absent from Washington, and party unity prior to Exile look all pretty similar.
But to be clear, that's unobservable. That's not.
Yes, Yeah, so you want to see the joint test as well. Yeah.
Some people say it.
Yeah. Yeah.
But, okay, but that's good. There is.
No, that's good.
But we measured everything we can measure here, right? There's no.
Yes, and that's actual evidence.
Right. This seems.
Plus the possible assignment mechanism that is against them. How many times do you have members that are same cohort and where you actually literally have an assignment?
Yeah, so I have to look it up exactly. I think it's about 60% of the cases are exactly random. I mean, within the same cohort, where we can have like people on either side just really coin flips. And if we restrict the analysis to those, we see similar results. We're throwing out a lot of cases, but which, given the sample size, is unpleasant. But yes, you see the same thing if we restrict the sample to the truly random cases.
And that's very encouraging because that is a randomization was done in the past, and arguably people are somehow aware and behaving differently. But I mean, that seems like that's the easier argument to just sort of say there are no measures of time.
Yeah.
But it just, that, I think the fact, and this, I think it's really cool, it's a really cool idea. The fact that it's clean, in some ways makes me not want to see the lag DV more. Because it's like if someone ran a real experiment and they presented it controlling for these lag, it would, it's sort of not the cleanest or simplest way you could do it. But.
Yeah, I mean, yes, we could just show the raw differences as well. And if you just look at the raw differences, everything looks pretty similar too. We put these controls in because people wanted to see these control and essentially to satisfy audience reviewers more than like other things, but that's not a great reason. We should have the raw differences as well. Yes. Yeah.
I just want to get a better idea of what is actually known when, but if I understand correctly, so it's between, say, November 2010 and January 2011. Let's say there are going to be 6 new Republicans on one of these really big committees that have a lot of members. And it's generally known, if I knew where to look, because I as a citizen could look it up, it's generally known that, okay, these are the 6 new Republicans who are moving on to Ways and Means, and this one has a pretty good chance maybe of being there forever because she's number 1 of those 6. And she might be going on to another committee, and by luck, she's number 1 out of 3 going on to that committee, and someone else happens to be at the bottom on both. And what, is it true this is generally known, or is it only a few?
Well, in terms of who's getting the initial committee, who's getting their new committee assignments, that part is a little bit less known. So essentially, there's a process by which members make new committee assignment requests, and so that part is revealed at a somewhat. It's revealed in that same window, but it's not revealed as early as this. Yeah.
But still, by
But
Groundhog's Day, everybody knows, and
Yes.
it's public information. We could look it up. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So meaning that if you guessed, if you thought that Republicans were going to gain 30 seats, you might be able to figure out more or less who's going to get put in exile before the election.
Yes, at some level the answer is yes, although remember, this is not a very well-known process. So actually, each time this happens, even though this has happened relatively frequently in recent times, everyone's blindsided by this, and members are shocked that this happens to them, and nobody, like members, you talk to them, and they don't actually anticipate this, and you get this like wide variety of stories that like this is completely new information to them. And if the members themselves don't know, I'm skeptical that the contributors do. I mean, maybe they're savvier than the members, but
It seems like such a big deal, though. So, I mean, you're ruining this by 2016. Everyone's going to know.
Well, you would think at some point that they, but the problem is it's happening to these new folks who usually weren't around when this happened in the previous waves, and so there is some sort of it's like preying on the new vulnerable innocent types who aren't as savvy about this process.
So plus all these counter arguments are assuming that I'm really corrupt. I'm paying you for access, but I'm not paying for access during this congressional session. I'm paying for access in the next, and I'm buying a future which is
Right. At that point, it's sort of evidence in the same direction. Yeah.
Do we know anything about the timing of this?
So we do know some things about the timing. So we know the actual date that the contributions happened. The only problem with that, and the reason I think people haven't done more to exploit the timing, is we have a reporting issue in terms of congressional staff reporting the contribution at slightly different windows, and so it's difficult to leverage too much precise stuff out of the dates. I think there's information there that more can be done with, but there's a little bit of blurriness around the date reporting.
Right. Money that comes in right
No, we could do more to exploit the timing of different contributions. I think that's certainly true. Okay, so let me actually show you the results. We're getting close to showing you the results. Okay, so again, in terms of our motives of contributors, again, for this access-motivated giving, if people are interested in sort of short-term access, more of a spot market giving, we'd expect a drop in contributions when members lose their committee seat. You had a sort of longer-term time horizon. If you're building these sort of long-term relationships, we might not expect that much change here. By contrast, if we're interested in sort of ideological giving, if you sort of this combination of electoral influence, sort of economic consumption, party-motivated giving, again, we wouldn't really expect much change. If anything, you might expect an increase in contributions as these members have lost their seat, and maybe you're worried about them getting reelected and holding on to the seat. So in terms of our design here, we're removing access and we're holding ideology constant. So we should really only see a drop in contributions for those who are access-oriented givers. Okay, so our first two case studies, how do energy PACs respond when members lose their seat on energy and commerce, and then how do finance PACs respond when members lose their seat on Ways and Means, the tax writing committee. And so to do this, we need data from the Center for Responsive Politics, and in particular, we're going to use their industry classifications for PACs. So they classify PACs into 410 different industry subcategories. And so when we look at our first question, or how these energy PACs are responding to energy and commerce exile, the dependent variable we're going to look at is energy PAC contributions to a given member. And we're going to use that same basic setup I talked about before with the sample restrictions and the various controls. And we're going to include an indicator variable. If you were exiled from Energy and Commerce Committee, essentially the committee that's most policy relevant to that industry, to the energy industry. And then we're also going to include an indicator variable if you were exiled from any other committee. And the idea is if you're sort of access motivated and you're the energy committee, you're going to mostly care and be affected by this energy and commerce exile, and we're not really going to see much of a change for these folks who are exiled from other committees. And then we're going to do the same thing, looking at how finance PACs respond when members lose their seat on the Ways and Means Committee. And so to do that, we're going to look at finance PAC contributions to a given member, and in this case, our indicator variables are going to be a Ways and Means exile, and then exile from all other committees. Okay, so how are these energy PACs responding? Well, the top row there is showing the effect of exile from the Energy and Commerce Committee. And what we see is that energy PACs sharply drop their contributions to energy and commerce exile, to the tune of about $100,000. And these are committee-specific effects. So members who are exiled from not energy and commerce or who are exiled from any other committee don't really experience the same type of shock. If anything, there's a slight increase in their contributions. There's certainly no clear negative shock going on. Right? So we're seeing those potentially most interested in the policy area of the committee abandoning the member, and everybody else staying the same or slightly increasing their contributions. Yeah, Patrick. Sorry, these are for this is for a given member. Sorry, this is member level.
Everything after they lose the seat.
No, sorry, this is just the election right after. Essentially, this is just the election right after.
So it's per term.
Yeah, sorry, yes, it's per term.
Where's the money go?
That is going to be the second part of the talk, and I will show you where the money is going. That is a great question. I'm glad you glad you answered that.
I want $20.
Yes, we'll do side payments afterwards. Yeah. Okay, and so we see an analogous story when we look at the finance PACs contributing to the Ways and Means Committee. Right, so we see this similar process where members who were exiled from the Ways and Means Committee experience a big drop in contributions to the tune of about $165,000. And by contrast, members who were exiled from any other committee, essentially not Ways and Means, experience no big drop in contributions, if anything, a slight increase in contributions. Right, so again, these are committee-specific effects. And was I, yeah?
You basically, you're running up on everybody in these committees of a particular party, those exiled and those not exiled.
Yes.
Okay. So you basically make a roster of all the committees, throw out all the Republicans, analyze them, correct?
Yes. Yes.
And then how are you merging different years, or is this just one particular order?
So we have committee and year fixed effects in year. Yeah.
Okay, but then how do you deal with partisanship?
Well,
Like, are you
essentially, so for any given year, there's only one party in there, right? So in any given year, for example, in 2010, only the Democrats are being exiled. So there's effectively only Democrats in there.
So your year fixed effects is also your party fixed effects?
Yes.
For that.
Yep. This particular one is just looking at finance tax, the giving it from finance tax. But for ways and means, we might care about all industries with the entire tax code. And so if we run the same thing for all PACs, we see about a $325,000 drop in contributions from all PACs to a single member in a single term. Right? So given that, again, this average house race in 2012 was about $1.5 million. This is real money. Okay, so we want to generalize this. And in order to do this, we want to talk about how are PACs responding to a change in legislative access. And here we're going to define access as sitting on a committee whose domain includes that particular industry. So to do that, we're going to again turn to data from the Center for Responsive Politics. And so we're going to use their industry classifications for PACs. And we're also going to use their industry committee crosswalk. So they essentially match up 225 industries with a single committee that covers that policy area. And so these committees that they do this industry committee mapping for are essentially the pretty narrow policy-specific committees. So agriculture, armed services, energy and commerce, financial services, natural resources, and transportation and infrastructure. Now, just through the sort of idiosyncrasies of the Exile generating process, we don't actually have any cases of Exile from armed services, so we're going to throw that industry committee out. But for the rest of these, we can look at this access relationship. So for our model here, we're going to use a similar setup to the one we were using before. Our dependent variable is going to be a specific industry's contribution to a specific member. So we're going to have 410 industry cases per member. And so we've defined this access relationship between 225 industries and 5 committees. And so we're going to use the similar base model setup that we were using before. But in this case here, we're going to have 2 slightly different indicator variables for Exile. First, we're going to talk about access Exile. So Exile from a committee that provides policy access for that industry. And then we're going to also have an indicator variable for a non-access Exile. So Exile from a committee that does not provide policy access to that particular industry. So how are these PACs responding to this access Exile? We see a very similar pattern. So members who are exiled, if there's an access relationship between the committee and industry in question, experience a big drop in contributions. And for members who are exiled and there's no access relationship between the committee and industry in question, don't experience that drop. If anything, they experience a slight increase in contributions. Now these, yes, so these effects are at the industry member level. And so in order to sort of get a sense of the scale of this, we need to aggregate back up to essentially consider the number of industries a given committee covers. So for example, energy and commerce has 85 policy relevant industries. And so just doing a sort of simple back of the envelope calculation, that would be about a $70,000 drop. If we were to look at the transportation and infrastructure committee, that committee has 44 policy relevant industries, which would be about a $35,000 drop. Right, so sort of again, broadly speaking, we're seeing this big drop in contributions for those when there's this access relationship involved. So the question is, Dustin's question exactly, where is that money going? And so where are these industry PACs donating after a new majority? And here we're going to depart from our Exile design to look at where the money is going. So in order to do this, we're going to look at our dependent variable as a change in an industry's donations to a given member. And we're going to have 410 industry cases per member. And we're going to use a minimalist multi-level model with individual legislator random effects. But these findings are robust to a variety of alternate specifications. And we're going to estimate these effects for 3 groups of legislators. So the first group of legislators are these members of the new majority who are new arrivals to the committee. These are folks who were in the minority, they're now in the majority, and they've replaced these exiles in the committee. So these are essentially the exile replacements from the opposite party. And we're going to break this down when there's an access relationship between the industry and committee in question and a non-access relationship. And then the second group we're going to look at are these members of the new majority who remain on the committee. So they were in the minority before, they were already in this committee, they just moved from the minority to the majority. Right? So they have more influence over what the policy that happens in the committee. And we're going to again break this down for access and non-access relationships. And then the third group that we're going to look at are the remaining folks, are the members of the new minority who remain on the committee. They were already on the committee before, but they avoided being exiled. And they moved from the majority to the minority. And we're going to again break this down for access and non-access relationships. so broadly speaking, what we see are the members who are experiencing the greatest increase in access influence are the ones who are getting this money. So the two rows at the top, these new majority and new arrivals, those folks are essentially the exile replacements, the people who got the committee seats of the opposite party to those who were being exiled. So if there's an access relationship, these new majority, new arrivals, these exile replacements get a big increase in contributions. And if there's no access relationship, they're getting maybe a slight bump or not seeing a big change. Now, of course,
sorry, what was the how did you operationalize non-access again? Until you said it.
Right, so we're defining an access relationship to be when the committee in question that the member is involved with oversees the policy domain of that industry.
So non-access is what they go.
So non-access is when they don't. So there's either this like access relationship or industry domain overlap, or there's not. Okay, and so then the second group are the folks of the new majority who remain on the committee. So they were already in this committee in the first place. They've moved from the minority to the majority, which gives them greater influence over the policy making process. And we see again these new majority people who remain on the committee. If there's an access relationship, experience a big increase in contributions. And if there's no access relationship, you get a slight bump from moving to the majority, but you're not really experiencing a big change. And then this last group are these folks of the new minority. They were in the majority and they avoided being exiled, but life was not great moving from the majority to the minority. And they really experienced maybe a slight increase, but again, they're basically staying the same on the committee. Right? So the money is going to these folks from the opposite party who experience the greatest increase in their influence over the policy area that the industry cares about.
Does the chair of the committee change like that?
Yes, the chair of the committee changes as well.
So the remaining access could be potentially do with the chair switching and then the chair of the committee.
Yeah, I'm actually surprised that intuitively along the line, I would have thought that the bump in this third row would have been larger than the bump in the first row. That the people who are remaining on after, they're going to be more senior, more influential, and so now they're on then these sort of newer people.
But they're already getting a
So they were already, here this is the change in contribution, so it's a somewhat misleading, right, because we're looking at the change in contribution. So I think they are, if you were to look at the sort of overall level, we're getting so much money before that they're not experiencing as great a change.
Right, but then it's sort of like you want to have it in like percentage terms or something, right?
Sure, yeah, we can look at it in terms of percentage terms too. Yeah.
In which case, in percentage terms, I would understand why the first row should be much larger, because they're starting from a lower base, they're getting this bump. But yeah, I don't know.
Yeah,
It's interesting there's a difference.
Yeah. Agreed. All right, and it's difficult to reconcile this pattern of giving with ideological giving, right? That's I think the sort of like larger overall point. And so what we're seeing here is PACs are increasing their contributions to members who experience the greatest increase in access influence. And so unlike exiles, any remaining sort of new minority members are basically experiencing no change overall. So we're seeing a loss of access result in a drop in industry's contributions. Where is that money going? Well, it's going to the opposite party. And so in particular, it's going to new access committee members and old access committee members. And so the answer to, at least one answer to why are people or industries giving, at least some of the time, it seems to be access-oriented giving. And we can talk about a sort of broader circumstantial case, and I want to be very clear this is a circumstantial case, that at least some PACs may seem to be giving to give access, and they're doing so repeatedly, right? These are sort of savvy elites who are in professional politics, who are in DC, who run these major contribution networks, and if they're giving to get access and they're doing so repeatedly, it's at least suggestive of the idea that sometimes they think they at least might possibly exert policy influence. But there are obviously a lot of caveats in there, but that's just sort of potentially part of this story here. And then we have a lot of next steps with the project. We want to look at individual contributors by employment industry. We want to exploit some of the geographic differences about in-state versus out-of-state donors. We look at how this shapes inter-party fundraising, and then also how the changing influence of committees over time. And some of this is going to be part of a larger book project as well. So if you have any other suggestions or questions, I'd love to hear.
So I think it would be interesting to look at these PACs and see whether they're allocating the same amount of money to the committee when there's been change.
Oh, yeah. I think they give up and go home.
committee, and certainly I'm an energy company, and Gary's now on this committee, and he's for art drilling, so I think that's great. I want to see, him stay, right? I mean, I think I'm somewhat worried about how you conceptualize access. I may want to give Gary money so he gets reelected, and I know he'll vote the right way, versus I want to give Gary money so he'll vote the right way. Those are two really different ideas. And it does seem to me that if I give the same amount to the committee, no matter what party's in charge and who's there, that sounds like bad access, right? I mean, I'm just trying to buy political influence. Whereas if the number of people on the committee who believe in are going to support the policies I like goes down, you would think that my contributions overall to the committee should go down, right? Because why would I give money to the other people? They're not going to be helpful. And at least it looked with your numbers like some of the money that they were giving previously was now going to the other party, but the magnitude of the numbers weren't such that it looked like all. And it sounds like you could actually do a difference there that would give you an estimate of bad access versus appropriate access. I'd actually just like to see the terminology change, right? Because Gary is always going to vote for Artie, really, no matter whether I support him or not, as long as he gets elected, then my support is just trying to improve the chances of his being elected. We're staying in office, right? Which is entirely different. I mean, I think we think that's okay. Sociologists are fuzzy on these things. Whereas obviously, if Gary's only going to vote for Artie Groving if I give enough money, then that's not good, right? So, what are they buying? Yeah. Are you buying getting him elected, or are you buying his vote on the committee for things?
Or maybe you're buying a lot of teeny little changes on the line.
Yes.
So access during the process when those little things are being made, those little decisions are being made.
Yeah, no, exactly. Well, I mean, we can certainly calculate these sort of committee-wide shifts and party-wide shifts in donating. So that's
Access, you get face time. Like donations translates to you get to talk to people.
yeah. I mean, members are legally allowed to actually sell their time. They're legally allowed to demand X dollars in exchange for setting up the meeting, and that happens frequently. And past donors and others are very honest about that.
I should do that with my grad students.
Side.
Can you actually, just to build on Chris's last comment here, can you use, I'm thinking like sort of like Adam Bonita's type data, where you actually scale the PACs ideologically, which then lets us then we sort of have some sense of like how ideologically, so it might be that the moderate PACs are playing this sort of both sides of the party game, and we don't see this for these extreme PACs. That would be interesting. He has all that in
That's a
Justin
good idea.
Caldas.
Yeah, that's a good idea. We could totally do that. That's a great idea.
You would worry a little bit, it's like you'd have it on that money would be both the X and the
That's
Y.
true.
Yeah.
But if
That's how
you
you scale
nailed the
that.
scaling right, it could still work.
Yeah. I don't know, it might be interesting.
This seems to sort of hint at a bigger question about definitions, which for me was like, can giving money to influence specific policies be ideological? Is this access ideological divide seems like it's defined in a certain way, but I don't know if it maps onto what we think of as being like totally separate things.
Yeah, I mean, we've struggled a bit with the sort of terminology that we've used to divide these different subcategories, and you see a bunch of different, there's a lot of different language used in the literature. We like access because it's a sort of broad category that it's a relatively broad category that includes a sort of a lot of stuff, but then the downside is it's including a lot of stuff that isn't as nefarious, right? I mean, that one isn't as concerned about, and so it's tough if you use sort of more narrow language that people use, then it tends to have an even more negative connotation. But if people have suggestions suggestions about alternative language or terms that they'd like to see, that certainly be open to
I'd like to see a mediation model with, donations affects the chances of getting elected versus there's a direct effect on policies that you estimate that you support. I think it helps pull out some of it. I mean, it doesn't pull out the, I went, and talked to the people and they changed their minds about how they think about them.
Yeah,
There's a legitimate versus.
you start to get into a whole another can of worms there of looking at how money shapes electoral outcomes, and that literature gets messy in its own right. It has some pretty messy.
So if you stick with Exile, you have a great paper title, which there's a great Rolling Stones album called Exile on Main Street. It used to be Exile on K Street.
Oh, I like that. I had no idea that I was going to get such great marketing insight here. I like it.
Yeah, so there was something you said when you were describing committee Exile that made me a little confused. So the premise is that you're holding ideology fixed and treating access. But then when you were describing Exile, you said one of the outcomes of Exile is that they vote differently. They start voting in their district. So do you have data? I mean, maybe that's just infinitesimal changes of emergence, but do you have data on how members vote on bills related to the subject area of the committee post being Exile? Are there any sort of systematic changes in that?
So we haven't looked at that, the sort of policy, the legislation that originates in the policy in the committee that the member used to serve on, and that's something we can certainly calculate, and it's on our to-do list of things to calculate. The earlier finding about this sort of change in voting behavior is pretty minimal. So basically what you see is that members who are from somewhat misaligned districts, so Democrats and conservative districts, vote just fractionally more in line with their district than they did before. So I'd be a little skeptical that that would be on the sort of wonky policy stuff that originates in the committee. I would guess that that's sort of more high. The intent of that is probably to appeal to the constituents and sort of on more high salience things. But we should do that. I like that idea.
Related to that, so the last 3 points is all about what the party, about how we measure ideology. There is this sort of, obviously, anybody studies communities, and I really realize this, but it's worth re-expressing it and reminding ourselves that in small policy domains, we don't necessarily know, particularly with self-selection into the policy domain, that party is a really good measure of ideology. Right? That is, whatever the ideological dimension is within armed services or something, or whatever that is. Amongst the people who self-select in, we don't know the party is a good measure for where they are ideologically. Now, Chuck Hagel's party is not a good representation for what he thinks about the things he self-selected into, because otherwise he wouldn't be in Obama's cabinet, right? Those kinds of things, right? So,
Yes. No, that's a great point.
Any measure of a better measure of ideology would be great for the party, or of course, obviously, being able to randomly assign people to committees would be wonderful.
That would do lots of great things for what we could do. But I think one of the things we've talked about doing is using some. I mean, interest group scores have problems, but then you have sort of like area-specific ideology scores, and so we could try to do something with that. I mean, there's variation in the literature about how out of line people think the committees are, so like how outlier they are. So some committees don't seem to be outliers really at all relative to the party across any dimension that we can find. There are others that are somewhat, but we can explore that. Right there?
Yeah, so I'm just curious about the savviness basically of these funders. So it seems like, and it came up a little bit earlier, they don't think forward very much. So surely it'd be better to sort of find some, ambitious congressman who's going to win an election a lot and start funding him, right? Like get him on the team really early in his career, and then eventually he'll be on a committee, and then so on and so forth. It seems they're very short-termish.
We were somewhat surprised actually that we could find such short-term behavior, because the literature actually characterize a lot of these relationships as sort of building these long-term, you're contributing now for many cycles down the road. And so, I mean, it's something I was a little bit surprised by, that they were so short-sighted.
Unless they just understand that this is really bad for your long-term prospects too. Could be.
Right.
And so I was just thinking, so some of these people get back on the committee, and wouldn't they then be like, well, you didn't really sort of help me committee place. And
But also, what's their seniority queue when they get on? Do they reset?
Yeah, well, there's no, effectively, they go back to where they were, because there's no intervening.
So it could still be it could also be a long term. They're just looking down the road. They know that it's happening today, but it's really bad for later.
It's like a bad sign.
Yeah, I mean, you'd think from a gratitude perspective that this is when the members are really desperate for contributions, and so you could make a lifelong friend. So in some sense, the fact that people continue to contribute to these folks isn't actually dispositive that they aren't seeking access. It just could be that they have a longer term time horizon. Right. That.
Get a dog, right?
It does seem pretty damn. I mean, the fact that funds, just in reference to a lot of the earlier conversation, a lot of, for example, ideological metrics and things like that, that informs sort of your second analysis of where the money goes. But to me, the more serious piece of evidence, especially because it's sort of somewhat, it does seem a lot like a randomized experiment, so quite possibly like a real thing, is the disappearance of contribution. I mean, to explain that or in any other way other than an access issue seems hard. Like I can't come up with a story as to why people would cut off people in the committee unless they thought that paying money to people in the committee would help them.
Could you tell some story about, well, I mean, you tell some story which you say, well, we think that people on committees are really close to making policy about gas and electricity, so we want to make sure they're educated, and so we pay for all these things, and I don't know, some story like this, where like you make some public goods case, basically, that it's really important to fund these people who've been on the committee for a long time because it's beneficial, and then once they're off the committee, I don't know, some story like that.
Yeah, I mean, that could be the sort of mild form of access, right? Like the sort of like that you're buying time with the intent to inform the career.
It's still you think that you're right and you want to make these people educated so you do what you think is right. Or,
sure.
If
That's
you
right.
want them to do what you think is right, or you want them to do what makes you rich. But either case, it's manipulation.
But it's informational, not
Exactly. I'm saying things like I want to inform them. They should be able to. I'm going to give them this money so that I buy their time to come to my trade show, so they can see that, pet code is actually good.
But the only reason you do that, like the reason you care, is because if it's just purely an education thing, then if they're off the committee, like if you're worried about their personal education, it's immaterial whether they're on the committee or not. If you only want to educate people on the committee, the question is why.
I'm worried about America, and so I want to educate the people who are closest to the decision-making process, and it's them. That's the story that you can tell.
And also, the underlying question is money corrupt beyond politics? And so one of these access is legally corrupt, and one of these forms of access, informational, is information, right?
We get better welfare outcomes because of it.
But another story would be the opposite, which is that the incumbents they work really hard to hit up these groups for these donations. They spend a huge amount of time doing it. They hate it. We know from your other paper that these people who get exiled change their fundraising behavior a lot. So it could be not an access story, but just these candidates are no longer going out and calling. They're no longer on the committee, so they're not calling up these PACs anymore. It's still kind of an access flavor.
Because they don't want any information from you.
Exactly. They don't need
That's right.
I mean, it's funny talking to both the PAC folks and the members, and they're clearly both being hit up, both asking for and hitting up these contributions, and so it doesn't seem like that side has changed. It seems like, if anything, that these folks who are losing their committee are working much harder to fundraise, and that they're going back to all of their old friends who are now saying no at a much higher rate.
So the people kicked off, because the people kicked off committees are actually generally succeed in raising more money. So you're simultaneously getting less money from the PACs that fed them, and they're getting more money, so they're getting money from elsewhere.
Yes, they're essentially getting money from PACs and individuals in other industry areas. They're working a lot harder to fundraise, and so I just have some preliminary stuff that in another project I have a data set that looks at fundraising events in Washington. So essentially these are fundraising events that are targeting these inside donors, and basically after Exile they're holding more fundraising events, right? So like they're working harder to get this money.
And we assume that's annoying because they would prefer not to do it or something.
Yes, that seems. But all the conversations that I haven't found a politician yet who I think sincerely enjoys that side. I mean, they're already expected to do a pretty high baseline. So already, for new members who enter the House, the party leadership sits them down and walks them through a template schedule of what their day is supposed to be like, and they're supposed to spend at least 4 hours a day on fundraising, both in terms of in-person events and phone calls. So nobody really wants to do more than that, right? That's a.
But it's fun, but the money is specifically to run campaigns in your home district, right?
Yes. Yes.
I always wonder, isn't there like decreasing returns? Like, I mean, how much do you need to win these? I mean, I know you have $500,000.
Yeah.
Fine,
Well,
but, is it worth having 700, 800?
Well, it can't. It doesn't have to be just used in your home district. So it can also be used to gain influence within the chamber. And so in my own work, in my book project, I look at how members fundraise and how that translates into influence within the chamber. And so they can essentially use it to buy influence within the chamber to get their own policies through. So it has not just a short personal electoral ramifications. It has.
What do the members say about losing? I mean, you told us what they say about losing their seat on the committee. What do they say about losing $160,000?
They don't like it.
But did they say anything to the PAC? Say, what were you doing? You were buying. What did you think you were getting for that? What did I do differently that how am I representing my constituents now? What were you buying? Do any of them actually go crazy?
They make a variety of arguments in their pitch. The PAC
But
goes.
that's quiet.
Right. Yeah, I mean, part of this, one of the sort of alternative interpretations is it's all just sort of rent. Nobody's getting legislative favors. This is just all rent seeking on the part of politicians. They've sold these PACs on the idea that they can provide these exclusive favors. And since that's the product they're selling, then they can no longer provide these exclusive favors. They can no longer, you have to be a little naive, I think, to sort of fully buy into that nobody picks up on the fact that they're being extorted for all this money repeatedly and there's no product being given, but that's the sort of alternative story about the rent seeking. So if they're selling that line hard in Washington, then
the real puzzle though is that it's actually an infinitesimally small amount of money for these companies.
Right.
It's not even the salary of the high-paid employees for either.
Well,
but that's
not necessarily a small amount of money for the trade association.
Yeah.
That is the politically savvy,
Yeah.
guru.
Right.
It's just like, some of these companies might be just rolling in money, but still, if there's a little bit of a downturn in the energy industry, which is in the papers, they sort of have an excuse to give each other, and so suddenly their trade association gets cut back 20% or something, and whoever runs the trade association has to manage with a budget which is 20% less, even though Exxon is still wealthy. Even it's like you say, infinitesimal.
It's just a puzzle.
No, the other thing I would say is, I guess, we effectively have rent control, right? That there are limits on these campaign contributions, and so the fact that the net amounts don't get that
Except
high.
the real puzzle is that these PACs never hit the limits, right? That's what's so weird about it. It seems like it should be so valuable to them to get all this access, and this is what we struggle with this in our work too. It's the same puzzle. They should be hitting the limits, presumably, if they care so much about it, and they routinely don't.
But if they can get what they want without hitting the limits, why would they waste the money, right? It's tough to know what the baseline is there.
In response to that, I would assume that so you could tell a more positive story, in which you say the problem is they don't want to hit the limits because basically there's some limit to what congressmen will do for the money. But you don't believe that, I guess. You believe that congressmen will do. If you just pay them more, they would do more for you. I just wonder if there's some limit to it, right? It's what they're running up against, unfortunately, is ideology of the congressman, some notion of self-respect, all this sort of stuff. I don't know what story you want to tell about why you just can't buy infinite access. They're not completely corruptible, and maybe that's an efficiency problem.
It suggests if the market is clearing, it suggests that the value they're getting must be very small if this is all they're going to pay for. So as you described, now there's a possibility the market's not clearing. It's not a competitive market for some reason, which it probably isn't. It's still a puzzle that Jim does this, and Jim and Steve do that in their papers. They try to back out for sort of a variety of models of how the market would clear, how much value they could be getting. And unless the return for each dollar is astronomical, it suggests that the value isn't very high, or that something else is going on, like maybe they're able to coordinate with each other to say, look, this is going to become an arms race if we all spend. So
From the opposite direction, this is not only a tiny amount of money for these corporations, but it's a tiny amount of money for the U.S. budget. And so for less than $1 billion, you can have fully publicly funded elections, and congressmen could have 4 hours of their life back every day.
Yeah,
Right?
yeah.
So why don't you just
Yeah, it's a good
kill the research question by saying, you know, let's spend $1 billion and nobody takes money from PACs, right?
Yeah.
Or everybody gets 4 hours of their life back. If you agree to do that, you get your $1.5 million, right? I mean,
Yeah. No, it'd
really,
be
what's that? Right. That's a wheel on an airplane. And
I mean, but it is true that, you know, one of the unintended consequences of all this is, so members are spending all this time fundraising, and their staff, these like 20-somethings, are writing all of the bills and all of the legislation. And, you know, these folks, I'm not that 20-somethings aren't amazing, but that, you know, that maybe there are some concerns about the like high turnover that we see then leaving for the corporate sector, given how poorly paid those jobs are too. I mean, you get into these like other ramifications as well.
I think you should be able to get some angle, some point of entry regarding this short-term, long-term question, at least for the large committees where large numbers of people are being exiled. Because if I understand correctly, going back to your example, where Congressman Schwartz lost her position, she was number 17, but Democrats number 16 to 21 were all exiled. So you have something like maybe 8 Democratic members of that committee who ranked, say, 14 to 21, who are in your sample. And the top 13 Democrats and all the Republicans on the committee are not in your sample. For those 8, granted, there's tremendous unpredictability, but some of these savvy PACs, they must have known during the time period while the Congress people are still raising money to try to get reelected. They knew the identity of number 20 and number 21, and they couldn't know exactly how many seats Democrats were going to lose in the House because of the Tea Party phenomenon. But surely they knew the Democrats were going to lose enough seats in the House that, numbers 20 and 21, the 7th and 8th ranking in your sample of 8 Democratic Party House Ways and Means members, that they weren't going to keep giving their places on the Ways and Means Committee. So you should see that a rank order variable for these, there was another committee where you showed, I think, once 11 Republicans lost their spots. And at least for the larger ones, it must be predictable that some particular lower-ranking members are going to lose their seats, predictable in advance, far enough in advance that that the money they raise during the preceding term is affected, or on some interpretations, according to some hypotheses, it's going to be affected and others not. So this is all sorts of implications, and I'm not saying, for one, I think it might show that you might be underestimating the effect of Ways and Means, because if number 20 and 21 had badly depressed fundraising already by April of 2010, it was they couldn't get any money out of the energy industry anymore, because everyone knew by that time that, and not everyone, but the people who weren't surprised to find out about Exile and who knew that Exile was coming up, at least those PACs, they knew that this particular Congresswoman, Schwartz's opposite, who ranked number 20, was just not going to be on the committee. And so maybe her fundraising would have been depressed already in the preceding. I think the general point is pretty clear. I think that the rank order data, the seniority rank order data might be useful to include.
No, I think that's right, and I think we should do more to explore the sort of time, temporal evolution of this, and we just haven't done that much there. But that's a great suggestion.
It's fun hearing you, so let's all thank you.